German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said the positions of Ukraine, its European allies, and U.S. President Donald Trump are very much in agreement ahead of Friday's talks between Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Following online talks with European leaders and Donald Trump, Merz stressed that fundamental European and Ukrainian security interests must be safeguarded. He also said Europe would continue to strengthen the Ukrainian army. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who also spoke to Trump, said he should be included in a meeting with Trump and Putin. He said that a ceasefire has to come first in any agreement and stressed that only strong sanctions will help put pressure on Russia. Well, after their virtual meeting with President Trump, Chancellor Merz and President Zelenskyy held a press conference here in Berlin. Here's what they had to say.
So if we're talking about Ukraine, there can be no discussions about Ukraine without Ukraine. We want a ceasefire. We want strong security guarantees. President Trump confirmed this and said he supports this. Russia cannot have a right of veto with reference to our own perspectives in Europe and in NATO.
Well, for more, let's cross over to our correspondent, Nick Connley. He's in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Nick, did you get the impression that Zelensky's meetings perhaps offer more hope for Ukrainians ahead of Friday's meeting between Donald Trump and President Putin?
I mean, certainly this European kind of show of solidarity, the fact that Zelenskyy was there in Berlin taking part in this call with Friedrich Merz and those other European leaders, that is certainly something that is important and is better than nothing, but it is still very much the compensation prize, the second best option to actually being in Alaska on Friday, as had been expected by people here in Ukraine. They had expected, to have Trump bringing Putin and Zelenskyy together, but we knew all along that Putin doesn't want to meet Zelenskyy directly. He constantly says that Zelenskyy is not a legitimate leader. So I think this is very much the best that could be salvaged from this situation, an attempt to try and set the agenda and to basically make it clear to Trump what Ukraine's red lines are. But certainly there is a whole lot of anxiety here about what could end up happening on Friday in Alaska and what kind of promises Trump might try to make to Putin.
Now, President Zelenskyy once again stated that there can be no discussion about Ukraine without Ukraine, but it's exactly that that's going to happen on Friday when Putin and Trump meet. Is there any plan in Kyiv, Nick, to push back against any deal that the U.S. may try to impose on Ukraine?
Well, certainly Donald Trump has less leverage over Ukraine than Joe Biden did, right? By the fact of his refusal to give new aid to Ukraine, the fact that basically all new U.S. deliveries of arms are for cash, either European cash or Ukrainian cash, that is something that basically frees the hands of the Ukrainians. They are now in basically direct commercial relations with lots of those U.S. arms companies, and in theory could carry on fighting even if the Americans wash their hands of them and just rely on European support. Now, in practice, there are lots of things still that the US provides in terms of intelligence sharing and also NATO support through NATO for European countries who then help Ukraine, who might reconsider their help to Ukraine if they weren't getting American help. But certainly this is the scenario that they want to avoid. They want to avoid the big kind of bang, the break with Trump in a situation in which Trump says this is the Ukrainians' fault. The Russians were up for peace and it was the Ukrainians who didn't want to go along with it. That is something that they are desperately trying to avoid, and we've seen European countries now doing their best after that bust-up between Zelenskyy and Trump in the Oval Office earlier in the year to try and smooth that all out and to make it clear that it is, at least from a Ukrainian perspective, Russia that is not up for this deal and that is causing, demanding things that simply aren't doable for Zelenskyy.
Nick, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Nick Connley in Kyiv. Let's cross now to our chief political editor, Mika Kufna. She was at that press conference with Chancellor Merz and President Zelenskyy. Mika, the German leader called today's talks constructive. Did he elaborate on what he meant by constructive?
Well, not very much. We got very little sense of what Donald Trump's reactions were to the positioning, clearly, that the Europeans did here and that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Ukraine's president, did. He did, though, say that President Trump agreed with most of what was mapped out by the Europeans. And that, of course, includes the Europeans together with Ukraine demanding that a ceasefire has to come first. Also that, yes, Friedrich Merz said that Volodymyr Zelenskyy would be open to talking about territories, but that would have to be in a process. That's clearly something that Volodymyr Zelenskyy himself just ruled out, standing next to Friedrich Merz, saying that he will defend the constitution, which doesn't allow for any territory to be handed over. Of course, constitutions can be changed with very large two-thirds majorities, but we got very little sense of what the tone of that conversation was. And the outcome very much also sounded like giving Donald Trump's himself or his staffers, again, the bullet points of what the Europeans expect to see as a bottom line. Because after all, what they had tried to avoid all along, which is that there is a direct conversation with Vladimir Putin over Ukraine, without Ukraine, that is taking place on Friday. And there seems to be a sober sense of standing up to or facing a reality that new facts will potentially be created, and Ukraine, the Europeans, will only be left to react to that. That's not the process Europe wants, it's not the process Ukraine wants, and that's also why we saw Friedrich Merz then say the Europeans want to see a bigger transatlantic architecture over security in the future, also that security guarantees are needed, then pushed on whether he would be willing to pledge security guarantees. He did leave that open. He said it's too early to talk over which country would take over what. So more questions really than answers coming out of this, and a sense that, yes, they probably got Trump somewhat on their course, but it's a very long time between those 48 hours before those two leaders sit down. And once they are one-on-one in a room, anything can happen, and that's what really sends the real shivers down the spines of many Europeans, and particularly of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who is very concerned over what could come out of there.
Okay, so we've had this flurry of Berlin-led diplomacy today involving Ukraine. We've had Ukraine's leader coming to Berlin to participate in all of that, and they've talked to Donald Trump, the U.S. president. Can you say, Mika, that Ukraine has any reason to believe that the picture has changed after all this?
Depends on which respect. I mean, this is it's created a platform of solidarity for Ukraine, clearly, with Donald Trump speaking to the Europeans. These conversations, the Kremlin has called them completely meaningless. Now it's up to Donald Trump to demonstrate whether he will hold the line of the Europeans and say and make clear that they weren't meaningless, that he is going to toe that European line, that he will create a bigger architecture, and that he won't just sell out Ukraine's territory for any kind of end of fighting and then call it a peace. So that's still an open question, and the Europeans have been here to some regard before. Today is day 100 of Friedrich Merz being German Chancellor. Just a couple of days after he was finally elected, he headed to Kyiv, taking along the French president, the British Prime Minister, the Polish Prime Minister. They were all standing there, and they spoke on the phone with Donald Trump, who agreed to demanding a ceasefire. There was a deadline, it passed, and nothing happened. And of course, they know that something like this could happen again, and yet we see the Europeans pulling out all the diplomatic stops here to contain him, also with public statements, and to hopefully get Donald Trump also on the record ahead of this meeting. And this is why everybody will be looking towards Washington, D.C., seeing what Donald Trump made of this meeting here today. So we're very curious to see that readout, the other side of the Atlantic, and learn whether both sides were actually speaking the same language when it comes to drawing a red line towards Vladimir Putin on Ukraine.
Mika, thank you very much. Our chief political editor, Mika Kufna. And this, of course, all has great relevance for Brussels as well. Our Brussels correspondent, Rosie Burchch, joins us now. She's been following the press conferences here in Berlin as well. Rosie, European leaders were involved in those teleconferences today, not just Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, but other European leaders as well. Any word from them about what was discussed and what came out of those discussions?
So the EU's top officials said this was a good call, something they welcomed. And we heard from French President Emmanuel Macron basically brushing off the fact that Putin and Trump are having this private tete-a-tete. He said it's normal that the US and Russia have bilateral relations, but that he would be fighting, that's the word he used, for a future trilateral summit with Trump and Zelenskyy. And he said he hoped that would be in a neutral European country. He said until there is a just and durable peace, that there must be continued support for Ukraine. And he said, when I say we must support Ukraine, I mean Europeans and Americans. So a clear message across the Atlantic there. Something else stood out to me, and that was from the European Council President Antonio Costa. He said that the US had showed openness to share with Europe efforts to reinforce security conditions when a just and lasting peace is obtained. Now, that sounds like a lot of jargon, but it may be an allusion to the US position on security guarantees for Ukrainian future. Until in the past, essentially, we heard the US saying that must be down to Europe. So if what Costa says is true, that would be a change in position. But I must say we heard nothing of the like from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, so it may well be a rather rosy interpretation from the EU side. Let's just note how much political capital the EU has put into trying to get the US on board with supporting Ukraine, keep it on side. Many European countries have radically ramped up their defence spending, something the US wanted. Many experts think the EU's shift to toughen its rhetoric on China is also a bid to please the United States. And I think, above all, the EU also recently accepted what was seen by many as a pretty bad trade deal with the US. And many sources were saying to me here, look, we think accepting higher tariffs is kind of the price to pay to keep the US on side when it comes to Ukrainian and European security. So if now we were to see the US try to strike a deal that would see Ukrainian European security sort of sold down the river, you can imagine that would be seen as very bad news, not only for the actual security architecture and situation here in Europe, but also, of course, for the EU's diplomatic capacities and clout. They hope these calls will have averted that scenario, but this is a very unpredictable administration, so they'll be watching very carefully on Friday.
Rosie, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Rosie Burchch, there in Brussels.
Let's get more on this from Yuri Rashettto, who covers Russia from Riga for us after officials closed down our Moscow bureau. Welcome, Yuri. So lots of diplomatic activity here in Europe ahead of Friday's Putin-Trump meeting. How much is Vladimir Putin taking the EU into consideration when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, I think, Phil, the EU plays no role for Putin at all. He considers European politicians to be weak and unimportant. Of course, he is demonstrating this once again with this summit with Trump, and Trump is even playing along. But Europe is still very important for Russia. Russia is geographically located in Europe and shares borders with European countries. Until recently, Europe was Russia's most important trading partner, and the EU is punishing the Russians with its sanctions. So in addition, the Europeans want to continue supporting the Ukrainians with money and weapons, even or especially if the Americans are not longer supposed to do so one day. This means that even someone like Putin cannot afford to completely abandon Europe, Phil.
Right. Let's talk about sanctions. President Zelenskyy said sanctions against Russia are working. Vladimir Putin said they're not. The EU now considering further sanctions. How effective are they when it comes to pressuring Russia?
Well, sanctions do have an effect, of course, but not nearly as much as the Europeans would like or the Ukrainians hope for. The Russian economy has not collapsed as expected. The ruble is still stable. People hardly feel the sanctions in their everyday lives. Yes, prices have gone up, but they have in Europe too. Experts talk about the long-term effects of the sanctions, and it may be that they probably will have indeed an impact at some point, but the war is continuing right now and should be stopped right now. What could hurt Russia much more would probably be the so-called secondary sanctions that Trump threatened to impose if countries that do business with Russia are punished. First and foremost, we are talking here about the largest buyers of Russian oil and gas, India and China, and that's because most of the money for Russia's war chest comes from there.
I'd like your thoughts on something we heard from President Zelenskyy today. He said that Vladimir Putin is bluffing that he wants peace. What do you make of that?
Well, I do not believe that a grand peace will be declared after the meeting. However, I do believe that Putin and Trump could agree on a temporary ceasefire in the air, which the Ukrainians would then agree to. Signs that Ukraine could agree to such a ceasefire in the air are already coming from Kiev. But for Putin, there is more at stake, Phil. He is interested in a change of political regime in Kiev. I'd like to remember our audience, one of the goals at the beginning of his war was the so-called denazification of Ukraine. By this, he meant probably nothing other than the removal from power of Zelenskyy, whom he considers an alleged neo-Nazi, which in turn was put forward as the reason for the invasion. So right at the start of the war, the Russians tried to quickly occupy Kiev, force Zelenskyy to flee or put him on trial. Even after 3.5 years of war, Putin has still not succeeded in doing so. He will try to do now with Trump.
Right, so a possible aerial ceasefire. Any other concessions? There's been a lot of talk of land swaps across the week.
Well, look, the question is whether Putin is simply buying time with this move, with this summit, and who would benefit from probably the stop in the airstrikes. I think that first and foremost it would be the Russians. Of course, it would save lives on both sides, especially in Ukraine, where civilians are being killed every day. Russia is also using the airstrikes as a deterrent and is therefore conducting psychological warfare. However, we must not forget that both sides are also conducting drone warfare, and the Ukrainians are also hitting Russian targets almost daily with their drones, primarily Russian energy infrastructure, oil depots, refineries and so on. Ukrainian drones regularly paralyze Russian airports so that the Russians also feel the war in their own country. From this perspective, stopping airstrikes would deprive the Ukrainians of the opportunity to strike back in Russia. That will be a most concession, but a concession that Russia would be benefiting from.
Friday won't be their first meeting, won't be the first meeting between Trump and Putin. Give us an idea of the sort of relationship between these two men, the power dynamic.
Well, I think for Putin, the meeting in Alaska has enormous symbolic significance. He will shake hands and talk not with just any Western politician, but with one of the most influential people in the world, who, of course, represents the Western world, which, according to the International Criminal Court, considers Putin a war criminal. Images of Putin and Trump smiling will go down in history. In addition, Putin will probably try to enter into talks with maximum demands, and that is far from peace in Ukraine, Phil, but rather Ukrainians' refusal to join NATO. Putin will most likely try to influence Trump to prevent such NATO membership with all his might. I can also imagine that Putin would influence Trump to discredit Zelenskyy, and possibly then disempower him from with Trump's help. These would be the political goals that Putin might want to achieve in Alaska.
Right. Thanks for talking us through that, Yuri, DW correspondent Yuri Rashettto. Well, the US president has described today's virtual summit with European leaders and Ukraine's president as a good call. He went on to say there could be another meeting between himself, President Putin, and President Zelenskyy if Friday's talks go well.
And we'll have a quick second meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy and myself if they'd like to have me there. And that would be a meeting where maybe it could be absolutely work. But the first meeting will not work that out. Certain great things can be gained in the first. It's going to be a very important meeting. But it's setting the table for the second meeting. I think the second meeting, if the second meeting takes place. Now, there may be no second meeting because if I feel that it's not appropriate to have it because I didn't get the answers that we have to have, then we're not going to have a second meeting.
All right, let's get more from our correspondent in Washington, Janelle Dumalo. Welcome, Janelle. What else did the president have to say today?
Yeah, Phil, so we heard it in that soundbite that you just played. If he has the feeling that this bilateral with Putin goes well, then he would very quickly organize a meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin with Trump himself involved if he is wanted. One can, I guess, assume that he sort of sees himself in a kind of mediator role there. But what we could kind of glean from his statement there is that he is in fact being very careful. He doesn't want to promise too much. He has several times in the past reference the fact that he would have what he felt were very good conversations with Putin, and then Putin would turn around and do whatever else he wanted on that battlefield, ignoring whatever conversation he might have had with Trump. Now, Trump, of course, in these statements also referenced the fact that he did not think he would be able to get Putin to stop targeting civilians. He said that he had talks of that kind of nature with Putin before, and Putin kept on targeting civilians. So it was interesting to see that what we have there is a president acknowledging the limitations of his influence on Putin, that he has very much also touted in the past. He also said that there would be severe consequences on Russia if Trump doesn't get the sort of answers that he wants to hear from Putin around ending the war. We don't know what those severe consequences are. He has not specified. We know, for example, that Trump has so far not endorsed congressional efforts to really get very severe sanctions on Russia and its trading partners. So essentially, as we know, the White House has been very careful to frame this as a kind of listening exercise. We heard again him use even another metaphor, setting the table. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said yesterday that what they wanted out of this was that Trump get a better understanding of what it would take to end the war. So essentially, what we have here is Trump believing that he might possibly be better able to get through to Putin in person after months of telephone diplomacy have not really yielded the results he wanted around ending the war.
And what did he have to say about today's talks with European leaders and Vladimir Zelenskyy?
Well, he's been very positive. We know that this is a president who loves ratings. He said, I would rate it a 10, very friendly. He also said that he would be calling Zelenskyy and European leaders immediately after the meeting on Friday, saying that he felt that the second meeting might be more productive than the first. But of course, as my colleagues have been saying ahead of me, the stakes could not be higher. European leaders are, of course, afraid that Trump and Putin might agree a deal over the heads of Ukrainians and over the heads of Europeans. But at the same time, Trump has stressed that he wants to hear the right answers from Putin around ending the war. But if he does not get them, I think European leaders are, of course, wary of the risk that he disengages from the process entirely. Now, Trump has sought to manage expectations. That call to the Europeans is perhaps also a means of calming them down, but there's very much the sense that anything can happen.
Thanks, Janelle. Janelle Dumalo in Washington.